What a beautiful introduction. Thank you. It is such an honor to join you. Hello. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be joining you. Today is the first day of my graduate program, the Spirituality and Psychology graduate program at Columbia University Teachers College. So I have 55 students in the next room, which is why I am joining you in this online way, but I wish so much I could be there in person. And in my heart, and as I see you here, even from the back, your heads, the back of your heads, I feel I am joining you in person. Thank you. I come to you as a clinical psychologist, as a scientist, and as a teacher who has tried to change academia to keep with the current science. So we now run the Spirituality Mind Body Institute, through which we train 55 students each year in a foundationally spiritual approach to psychology at Columbia University Teachers College. I'd like to share with you a bit about this program, but also the science on which we have built our work. So I'm going to share with you now, so the science. Uh, you will hear from my very treasured colleague as well. I know today my very treasured colleague is in the room, Dr. Andrew Newberg. And we have been colleagues and friends for a very long time. So we're also sharing the day. And I'm happy to offer you one line of research, and he will offer you more research. And I hope to invite you to take this research so that it might be foundational to your understanding of the human composition. What is the portrait of whole person development, treatment, recovery, and renewal? Recent Surgeon General Vivek Murthy points to four pillars of whole person formation: spiritual health, mental health, social health, and spiritual health. Spiritual health is one of the four pillars of whole person mental health. And I have been working extensively for 3 years with the United States Pentagon, and now for 2 years with the Department in the US of Health and Human Services to translate this science into whole person health and wellness in such a way that supports the spiritual core of the whole person. So moving from the four legs of the table, the four pillars, to one model in which actually the spiritual core is the hub of the wheel, the center of the formation of the whole person. The science I will share with you today is all referenced in my book, The Awakened Brain. The Awakened Brain covers the past 25 years of science as it relates quite specifically to spirituality, universal, common spirituality, as it is in every single one of us, and the importance of spirituality onto mental health and wellness, focusing primarily on depression and suicide, trauma, and addiction. So the science is quite clear that every single one of us is a naturally spiritual being. But while we do not make the fire, we do not create the spiritual reality, we are indeed carriers from one generation to the next. It is not by picking up a book at 20, but it is in the intergenerational passage, the relational transmission of spirituality, that this natural capacity is formed. In the New York Times, David Brooks wrote an article on my first book, The Spiritual Child. In the New York Times, he spoke of spiritual capital. As you know, Vivek Murthy spoke of spiritual health. Whatever one's term, the notion that there is a deep common spirituality in all people, every single being. This is a study by McKinsey, a global study of about 60,000 people, of whom 16,000 were people in Gen Z. And what was found by McKinsey in the global survey was that good spiritual health, they chose the word health, was associated with nearly a fourfold increase in good mental health, 2.5-fold good increase in social health, twofold increase in physical health. And this was true all around the world. Good spiritual health. So what is spirituality? Remember, we are looking at two claims: that we all are naturally spiritual beings, and that spirituality is foundational to whole person formation towards mental health, quite specifically depression, addiction, and recovery from trauma. So claim number one, what is spirituality? Using a twin study design, Ken Kendler and colleagues in 1997 with a replication in 1999, Ken Kendler showed that the capacity for transcendent relationship, quite specifically, I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask, what really does my higher power want me to do? Nature is a sacred place. Kendler was not measuring a belief. Kendler was measuring a capacity for perception, a lived relationship, guidance, love, relational spirituality. And what Ken Kendler found was that this notion of transcendent relationship was 27% attributed to broad heritability, which means that there is an innate capacity for spiritual awareness. But, and others have replicated that since then within, it ranges from 20 to 35 to 40, but there's an innate capacity for spiritual awareness. But that does mean that it is at least two-thirds developed, 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed. Religion are beautiful world faith traditions. Whether I am Hindu or Catholic or Christian, Muslim or Jewish, Jain or Buddhist, whatever my tradition may be, our world religions are environmentally transmitted. We are not born religious. We are born spiritual beings. Religion, environmentally transmitted, sacred texts, community, practices of worship, ceremony, our gifts of our parents, our grandparents. We may choose a faith tradition. Religion is often the embrace, the environmental embrace of our natural spirituality. The part of the formative cultivation of passing the torch. But spirituality is true of every human being, whether or not we are religious. And as such, there are regions in the brain in every human being. If you pull 10 people off the train from Zurich to Basel, all 10 of them, every one of them, has the capacity for natural spirituality. If you pull 1,000 people out of the United Nations, every one of them has the capacity for natural spirituality. And quite specifically, what we have seen is that the same circuits run during a moment of transcendent relationship. Whether I am Hindu or Catholic or Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Jain or Buddhist, there is one set of circuits through which the transcendent relationship is experienced, and they are true irrespective of whatever faith tradition I may be, whatever religion I may be, or if I am not religious. What you are looking at here is structural findings. This is actually a significance map. My colleague shared with you that I worked for many years, 10, 15 years, with Dr. Myrna Weissman. Dr. Weissman, in the about 1982, 84, went into a depression clinic and found women with recurrent major depression, women who'd struggled and struggled and struggled. And then she went out into the community and found demographically matched controls. She took her two conditions of women with recurrent depression and women who had no history of recurrent depression, and created a high risk and a low risk condition, who she then followed for 40 years in a longitudinal study, embracing their children, generation 2, their grandchildren, generation 3, and even their great-grandchildren, generation 4. It was a great honor and joy to collaborate with Dr. Weissman as we looked longitudinally at the intergenerational transmission of depression as well as spirituality. And what we found, these folks are in generation 2, right here, these lovely volunteers who you see right here in a portrait. These volunteers are generation 2. They are the children of depressives and the children of non-depressives. In this slide, everyone is together. And what we found is that when people sustain a spiritual life over 8 years, we published this in JAMA Psychiatry in 2014. It was the first of 10 years of studies on the neural correlates of spirituality, quite particularly as protective against depression and addiction. The neural correlates of universal spirituality from the subway or the bus or the UN or any client in the waiting room. And the neural correlates of universal spirituality is protective against depression, addiction, and in recovery from trauma. People who over 8 years sustain a spiritual life show cortical thickness, greater cortical thickness across the regions here represented in red of the occipital, parietal, and precuneus, which is to say these people in Dr. Weissman's study who sustained a spiritual life over 8 years showed greater cortical thickness across regions that another team had found not to be thick, but thin in people with recurrent major depression, offering some evidence that sustained spiritual life may be neuroprotective against recurrence of depression. How much so? Well, we looked at these lovely folks through another lens, both through here, the MRI, structural MRI, but also through the long-term clinical course lens, epidemiology. And what we saw was that these people with a thick red brain today did not get there at time 1 easily. We went back from the 8 years, back from time 1, and found that these people with at time 1 who said, yes, my personal life, my personal spiritual life is very important to me. In order to have established that sense of spiritual importance in their life, daily walk, daily perception, were 2.5 times more likely to have suffered from a major depression prior to time 1. 250% more likely to have had MDD prior to time 1. And yet once established, if stable between time 1 and time 8 years later, showed sustained spiritual life that went hand in hand with cortical thickening across these regions of the awakened brain. We then looked prospectively and said, well, how are they doing now? At time 8, they had far less depression. For having sustained their spiritual life, at time 8, they had far less depression. How much less depression? What is the case that sustained spiritual life might be neuroprotective against recurrence of MDD, major depression? Well, the people in the low risk group, the descendants of the people out in the community whose moms were not depressed, for sustaining spiritual life derived about a 75% protective benefit against recurrence of depression in their own life. But the people who were in the high risk group, the people who grew up with a mom who was depressed, the people who were at genetically higher risk for depression and environmentally higher risk for depression. You know, it is always the Joneses who get the short end of the stick, depressogenic thinking in their home. Those people at high risk were over 90% less likely to have a recurrence of depression if they sustained a spiritual life. suggesting that those people who are most prone to depression benefit the most, and perhaps even through a neuroprotective process of sustained spiritual life. Again, irrespective of if I am Hindu or Catholic or Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever my faith may be. The second interesting point raised by Craig Tankey, a member of our team, the late Craig Tankey. Are we good? Yeah. Is that no matter what tradition or way through, strengthening of the cortical regions of the awakened brain goes hand in hand with sustained spiritual life. Is it possible that the high-risk group, those who are both most sensitive to depression and most benefiting of sustained spiritual life, are actually the most sensitive, the most open? They are our healers, our shamans, our artists, our musicians and poets. Is it possible? Because of the 5 major dimensions of personality as measured by the big 5, introversion, extroversion, if I'm tightly wound or laid back, the only dimension of the big 5 personality structure that is predictive of spiritual awareness is openness to experience. So is it possible that people at high risk for depression are actually more sensitive? And it is even more important that they strengthen their spiritual awareness. Again, in the awakened brain, I get into the references, both the MRI studies and the epidemiological studies, in very broad strokes, over now hundreds of peer-reviewed studies. A standard deviation above as compared to below the mean in relational spirituality, a relationship with the deeper source of life, God, the universe, Hashem, Jesus, Allah, whatever one's word or conceptualization is, a sustained relationship with source and the ability to feel that great love, the higher power, in our relationship with one another, vertical and horizontal relational spirituality, versus a standard deviation below the mean is associated with, all told, a 4/5, 80% decreased relative risk of addiction onset, going through the window of risk, the trailhead, which is late adolescence. 60% protective against major depression if you look cross-sectionally, but we understand there's a very intricate, deep intertwine between depression and spirituality. 70% protective against risk, and in a study of studies, a meta-analysis, there was an 82% decreased relative risk of completed suicide when spiritual life is shared in a community, in a session. I once was visiting an inpatient unit in Bavaria. A young man in German leaned over next to me, and he said, "I find this science to be very reassuring." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, to know that this is my natural spirituality. I have been very traumatized. No one can ever take this away from me." Trauma. Here is a study of 3,000 plus. This is a study by Tsai, TSAI, also referenced in The Awakened Brain. TSAI and colleagues looked at 3,000 plus vets, people who had fought in war. And what they found was that amongst this sample, all of whom met criteria, everybody had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Out the x-axis was more and more and more higher levels of symptomology. Up the y-axis are units of growth. More struggle, more growth. More struggle, more growth. More struggle, more growth. And so we are so far out in level of symptoms, so flooded with symptoms that we need support to grow. Post-traumatic growth. Tedeschi also referenced in The Awakened Brain. Tedeschi said, how do I help my client? How do I help my family, myself, get up, up, up on the curve? There were 4 predictors. 3 are familiar to mainstream psychotherapy. Access to the very traumatic experience. Put the experience into words. Share it in a group. But then 4, shine the light of the higher power, God, Hashem, Jesus, the universe, onto the very experience. And then I saw God had been with me all along. And then I knew I was not to blame. And then I saw the universe had carried me through. There is a deep rearrangement of meaning that speaks to a wiser part of ourselves, and we are less ashamed and actually draw closer to our higher power. Now, this science recap, we are naturally spiritual beings, but it is 1/3 innate, 2/3 formed. When we cultivate our natural spiritual awareness, there are common circuits in the brain in 10 out of 10 people on the subway, 1,000 out of 1,000 people in the UN. Every client in the waiting room has the same circuits for transcendent relationship. Just as we all have a common circuitry for visual perception or auditory perception, there's a common pathway to perceive spiritual relationship. And I speak in detail on the awakened brain, in the awakened brain. When we strengthen this natural set of circuits, we strengthen them, we appear to thicken the cortex and derive neuroprotective benefit against recurrence. But that doesn't come easily. We have cultivated a spiritual response to suffering, a spiritual response to suffering that is then positioning us to move through difficult times, including trauma. Why is this relevant? As you know, the World Health Organization and many global health organizations are tracking an epidemic of the diseases of despair across the world, across decades, but particularly loading into young people. Gen Z, people who are 15, 20, 25, have higher rates of addiction and depression and even suicide than we have seen before. And in the United States, they are not necessarily the young people who have the hardest life materially. They are not the ones struggling with the most poverty or the ones who've escaped the most trauma. It is broad and pervasive, with some indication that actually young adults in very comfortable, if not highly resourced conditions, have even higher rates of addiction and depression and suicidality. So traditionally in mental health, we have located at the individual level treatment. In the United States, 55, over half of Gen Z meet a moderate level of a disease of despair, a clinically moderate level, which means intrusive and painful, which means in the way of their growth and development. So perhaps we need to get way ahead of this, from treatment to prevention, to wellness, to formation. To formation, is it possible that just as we have toxins in our water and in our air, there is toxin in our culture? There is a tidal wave subsuming young people, a toxin in a cultural situation. And I would suggest to you that it has to do with the annihilation of relational spirituality, both vertical and horizontal. A weakening of the direct relationship to God, the higher power, the source of life, and a weakening of the awareness of the divinity, the sacredness of who we are to one another. Vertical and horizontal relational spirituality. And where this really strikes hard, in the path of development, all of us face moments of existential despair, naturally, organically. In fact, any human capacity has a developmental trajectory. And we see that in adolescence, there's an acceleration of spirituality, which often kicks off with augmented capacity as a half empty glass of existential struggle. This is your 16-year-old, your 18-year-old. This is your college sophomore. What is my purpose? What is my meaning? What is the purpose? The meaning What am I going to be? And I don't mean is it medicine or law or teaching. I mean the meaning of life itself. Is God real? The universe? Is there a divine consciousness? This process of developmental depression appears to be hardwired. Again, any human capacity, including spiritual perception, has seasons of acceleration, developmental windows, of which the first appears to be puberty, launching adolescence. We see in longitudinal twin studies, think back to Kendler, we see a surge in the heritable contribution from 15 to 18 to 20 to 22 to 24. There is an unlocking from the inside out, a surge. What is my purpose? What is my meaning? This is a beckoning for the formation of the 2/3 we might support, a spiritual response to suffering. I'm suggesting there's a developmental imperative through which we are pushed to struggle to widen the lens, open the aperture, and let in more light. This is the formation of the red brain. Remember, people with a sustained spiritual life were 250%, 2.5 times more likely to have gotten there this way. Despair potentiates a process of awakening. What God do you ask of me now? What really is the meaning of life? What is the significance in all time of my life? Is there meaning written into the universe? This process potentiates a strengthening and a welcoming of prayer and meditation, collective reflection, relationship to nature. Spiritual awakening. Developmental depression is a knock at the door through which we may awaken. Developmental depression is a hardwired body, mind, and soul knock at the door through which, if we say yes, we can cultivate an awakened brain, which once strengthened is prospectively neuroprotective against recurrence. This is all in the awakened brain, all referenced stories and practices in the language of life for people that have been used in all different faith traditions, again, Catholic, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, or no tradition at all, spiritual, but not religious, and in German. Let me now, I'm going to grab just one more. Let me now offer you a look at the positive side of formation. If spirituality is innate, if it is part of every human being, physical, mental, social, and spiritual, if every one of us is a naturally spiritual being, then how might it improve our lives? How is it, through the lens of psychology as it exists, that spiritual life makes us stronger, more capable, better people, more ethical, more kind, more loving? Or does it? Does it at all? So in the gracious introduction, it was shared that I was a student of Myrna Weissman at one point and worked for 15 years there. And even before that, long, long ago, I was a student of Martin Seligman in the 90s, the mid 90s, when he was starting the positive psychology movement. Martin Seligman was an Aristotelian. He thought that virtues were values. And he also thought that virtues were, as character strengths, points of traction towards meeting our goals, our mission. And he was very, very dear to me, like an uncle. We're very, very close. Where we never agreed was on what spirituality is. We had a wonderful, spirited, different points of view on how does spirituality fit in to positive psychology. So here I show you the first of a series, again, a series of studies on positive psychology and spirituality. Let me invite you to think of a young person you know with lots of meaning, lots of grit. Now someone with gratitude, optimism, forgiveness. How many young people are you thinking of? Many people will say one, and you know many young people who are wonderful, and still one person comes to mind. The character strengths and virtues, it turns out, grit, optimism, gratitude, forgiveness, in this study of 5,500 college students, did not sort evenly amongst people. There were naturally occurring groups, naturally occurring categories using latent class analysis, through which we found some young people were high in everything. The very same college student who has lots of grit, has lots of optimism, has lots of forgiveness and meaning. They're up there in blue. Then those students down here in red, they're low in everything. They're low in character. Character, the great preponderance of the variance in character is global. Character is largely a global trait. The green folks are down the middle. And whether I am high blue, middle green, or low red, character seems to go hand in hand on the far left with daily spiritual awareness. And when we indeed looked, this study's cross-sectional, instead, longitudinally, it was daily spiritual awareness that predicted character. And this was true starting at age 8 and again at puberty through adolescence. Here's a sample of 270,000, over 250,000 young people, a global sample. Our lab, the Spirituality Mind Body Institute, worked together with the VIA, the Global Platform, Values and Actions, originally co-founded together with Martin Seligman. And you can see here, using a much more extensive sample, 270,000. This is published in the Journal of Positive Psychology, and using not single traits, but whole scales of the standard measure of the character strengths and virtues: justice, temperance, humanity, courage. The same pattern emerges: high, medium, lower medium, low, all anchored in spiritual awareness. Why is that? Because here's the hard work of growing up. This was from my first book, The Spiritual Child, and that's also translated in German as well. The Spiritual Child, page 246. Oftentimes principals in the States rip out page 246. I wish they would simply copy page 246, but they hold on to 246. And what we see here is why. Why is it that a strong cultivation of spiritual awareness, the spiritual core, the hub of the whole person, the hub of the wheel, from which comes social, moral perception? Who am I? Here's the hard work of growing up. Who am I? Down the left column. Who are you? What is our relationship? And what is the nature of reality itself? And here's how I might address that. Who am I? From a view with and without a strong spiritual core. Who am I? I am the one who was in the top 1% in high school, and I am going to get a degree in engineering. I am the top. I am very gifted in math. I had the highest levels in the States. I've had advanced placement, and off I go. Actually, you know what? It is May, and I have not been accepted to any university. I am in the bottom 10%. Who am I? Without a spiritual core, I am my performance, my outward performance, my traits, my abilities. Why is that a concern? Well, say I am the top 1% and I am off to university and I'm studying engineering, and suddenly I look over. It is now October. We've had 2 exams. And right next to me is another student. I look at my paper. I just received a 78. They received a 98. I am no longer in the top 1%. Outside of highly competitive high schools and at very, very top colleges in the United States, we have very high rates of suicide. As you know, the #1 killer of youth in the United States is no longer auto accidents. It is rivaled by suicide. If I am not outwardly successful, I am nothing. If I am not good at something, I am a failure. There is no existential being beyond transaction. A public square silent on spiritual life, a public square silent on the free expression and connection of relational spirituality is a cold transactional public square. But let's tell it another way, okay? And that does not need to be that way. Let's tell it with a spiritual core. Who am I? Well, yes, I'm very good at math. Yeah, I was the top 1%, but that is not who I am. Who am I? I am a being of infinite worth. I am a soul on earth. I am a child of God. How do I know that? Because you told me that every day growing up. When you picked me up from 3rd grade or 10th grade, you did not say, how was the math test? You said, I'm so happy to see you. Can you tell me a beautiful moment, a funny moment, a great moment from today? Can you tell me a sad moment, a learning moment, a growing moment? You brought me into a sense of life itself. And could you feel the presence in our family's words of God, the higher power? Was there a moment where you felt God's presence? We talk about God. We talk about spiritual life. Okay, I'm off to university. I just got a 78. The student next to me got a 98. That is very disappointing. I am not in the top 1%. But it is not existentially annihilating. Why? Because I am more than my performance. And what is math? Math is an endowment. My good skill at math, it is a gift. So that I might come forward to perceive my calling. So that I might discern my ultimate purpose. And today's mediocre, even failure experience, that is just noise. It is noise on the larger trajectory of my ultimate calling, my sacred purpose. And finally, if I am a soul on earth, you are a soul on earth. You, the student sitting next to me. So our relationship is not about, as we say in the States, keeping up with the Joneses. Our relationship is not only about narrow competition, but rather not keeping up with the Joneses, but walking with the Joneses. We have other things to share than your 78 and my 98. Can you tell me a story from this weekend? Just like my parent picked me up. What was the funniest thing from this weekend? Was there anything beautiful? Did you take a hike? Relational spirituality. And when we can use a spiritual response to suffering, when we can ask a question, why is this happening to me? If we have cultivated a spiritual response to suffering, if we have cultivated access to transcendent awareness, relational spirituality as a way through depression, trauma, and even moments that are good and beautiful, we start to strengthen the relationship between ways of knowing. In this study, we found that people who connect between asking questions with what we call achieving awareness. Why is this happening? What do I need to do? Where am I going to go? And what is life showing me now? Myelinate the tracks. This is DTI, strengthen the connection between ways of knowing. Every one of us is built to be able to perceive transcendent, as well as be strategic, tactical. And broadly put, when I help in clinical settings or educational settings, or in my 3 years with the Pentagon, or as I work now with Health and Human Services, I suggest that there are multiple ways of knowing, all rooted in the brain. We don't have a way of knowing that's not rooted in the brain, right? It all happens real time in experience and in the brain, right? Body, mind, and soul, material and consciousness. I ask people, can you tell me a time when you made a very important decision? Did you use in your most important, let me ask you here now, in making the most important decision of your life. Take a moment, perhaps, identify an extremely important personal, perhaps for your family, professional decision. You did the research, I'm sure, room of researchers. You identified possibilities and tactics, proliferated options. But how did you make the final decision? After you were moved through these forms of achieving awareness, tactics, research, and drew up all archival information from this moment backwards, how did you make the actual decision? Did you just know it in your heart, in your gut? Did you just know it in your gut or your heart? Was it intuition? Did you have a dream, or in your prayer life or meditation life receive a direct knowing, guidance, a mystical experience? When I share this with top military people, when I share this question with top business people, usually 80% or more will say the most important decision of their life was made through awakened knowing. This is transcendent awareness. Transcendent awareness is different information than achieving awareness. Achieving awareness strategy research holds information much like AI from today backwards. All the information from today backwards. It is inherently archival and all permutations and iterations thereof. Awakened awareness, intuition, gut instinct, mystical visitation, synchronicity has information that has yet to unfold before us. There are 3 bridges in life where we are prompted and invited to cultivate our awakened awareness. The first we've explored, developmental depression in adolescence. But I promise you, I'm in my 50s. I promise you, if you are not yet in your 50s, that you have another opportunity for developmental depression. Developmental depression comes back at midlife. And while we have transactional names, sophomore slump, midlife crisis, these actually, once again, if we look at long-term clinical course studies, are opportunities as there is a surge in spiritual growth, hardwired capacity, greater capacity for spiritual awareness. We can experience questioning and struggle. What does it all mean? The wider lens. What is my purpose? At 20 years old, what is my meaning and what is my purpose? At 50 years old, am I living my meaning, my purpose? How do I treat those in my family, those with whom I work? What is my spiritual footprint? When we look in long-term clinical course studies, again, in collaboration with the beautiful 40-year data set of Myrna Weissman, we found that at midlife, those people who had a strong spirituality at 30 and 38 and 40, suddenly those with the strongest spirituality had the greatest likelihood of midlife depression. Developmental depression came back, and yet once established and strengthened again, spirituality proved protective going forward. The third bridge, remember, adolescence, midlife, is the ascension to elderhood. Developmental depression that opens to augmented spiritual growth, so we might inherit the next station of our lives. I want to share with you that when we invited those nice participants, those generous participants, can you imagine sticking around any study for 40 years, bringing your kids and your little precious grandchildren? These lovely people came back. They did MRI and they also did EEG. And what we found of the people to recover from depression through a deepening of spiritual life, the red brains, was that they also gave off a different wavelength. They gave off posteriorly, where the many traditions cover our head, high amplitude alpha. High amplitude alpha, which, as you know, is jump-started with SSRIs. SSRIs jumpstart alpha, high amplitude alpha, and is often one of the foundational wavelengths given off the back ahead of a meditating monk. High amplitude alpha goes by another name in another field. It's Schumann's resonance, Schumann, Schumann's resonances, the constituent wavelength from the Earth's crust up 1 mile to the ionosphere, instantiated by lightning, which means it is the band of wavelength, we'll call it wavelength for the moment, around our Earth, where everyone else lives. What this means is that the spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the wavelength of all life and nature. That perhaps the perceived oneness we experience in transcendent connection is felt phenomenologically, but measured as a singular wavelength through all life. Unitive awareness mirrors unitive reality. Oneness. And so I would like to suggest to you as scientists that Eden was not long ago and far away. Eden is here now, and it is our choice to enter through our seat of awareness.